Welcome to High Noon, where we talk about controversial subjects with interesting people. Jeremy Wayne Tate is the CEO of Classical Learning Test, an alternative to the SAT, and a classical education advocate. He hosts a podcast called Anchored, and I think he's right at the center of this growing web of new schools, co-ops, academic conferences, debates, all centered around a more classical vision of education and what the Western canon might have to teach us, and how relevant it still remains to what used to be considered education, or being a well-educated person. Um, since we are coming up here on National School Choice Week, I wanted to invite him on High Noon to talk about that vision, which I think is, and we'll talk about this, largely, if not entirely, incompatible with the structure and underlying foundations of our current public education system. But really, it has so much to offer the debate and the place that we're at as a country as well. So welcome, Jeremy, to High Noon.
Inez, thanks so much for having me.
So you and I go way back, back when I was an ed policy wonk exclusively. Yeah. So we've been talking about some of the problems with the education system for a long time. But explain for folks, what is CLT? What is the CLT vision of education?
Yeah, Inez, thanks so much. And I always give the disclaimer. It may sound like, wow, this is going to be boring. We're going to talk about a standardized test, which really at the core of it is what CLT is. It's a classic learning test. It's an alternative to the SAT and ACT, but it was really born out of this conviction that these tests really they drive what happens in the classroom. A lot of private schools, especially private Christian Catholic schools, but also all kind of public schools, if they were actually forced to compete, which they're not. But the ones that do have to compete, mostly the way they have to compete is through something connected to the College Board, right? They're competing based on the number of national merit winners, right, which comes through College Board, right? The PSAT. They're competing on their average AP score or their average SAT score. And it ends up becoming a really powerful driver for everything that happens in the classroom. The problem, though, is that the College Board is radically disconnected from the kind of education really that gave birth to America, which is classical education. And so the idea behind the CLT is pretty simple. It is to create a competitor to the College Board that would drive direction towards the tradition that was foundational to America rather than away from it.
Yeah, there's nothing more boring than those SAT passages. I used to be a test prep teacher for the SAT, and so I know the test better than 99.9% of people, because I've probably taken it dozens, if not 100 times. And the company I worked for, which I won't say the name of it here, but they used to give the teachers every year or so, they used to administer a test, the SAT, but they would give us the reading section without the reading passages, right? So all we had were the questions and the answers. And we could guess based on knowing a lot about the test and knowing sort of the politically correct mindset from where it came and the College Board. We got like 50 or 60% of the questions correct on average, which is way above the 20% that would be random, right? So we were scoring sometimes well into the 500s on the reading section without reading a single word of the passages, right? So it just goes to show how substanceless in the better sense, like in the higher sense, these tests actually are. And as you say, they drive curriculum all over the country.
Yeah, Inez, I think a lot of people still have a picture of the SAT being like what they took in high school. The only thing about the SAT that has not changed is the name, and that it is still in English. That's it, right? Everything, if you took the SAT before about 2006, everything else has changed, right? There's no analogies, there's no logic questions. Everything that you remember making the SAT is now gone. It really is a really, really different test. And the rigor, I mean, the new SAT that they released in 2016, they released a concordance chart comparing the 2015 and the 2016, and everybody just gets 70 points on the new SAT, right? It's just a shameless kind of dumbing down of standards.
Speaking of dumbing down of standards, I think a lot of people, particularly on the right, but also a lot of apolitical people, when there's this movement now to drop the SAT from college admissions, and they're worried about that, right? Because it seemingly is the only standardized, or the only thing that cannot be manipulated to some. Although as a test prep teacher, I would say that it's completely manipulable. But they're worried that dropping the SAT will mean a drop in rigor, and sort of objectively measurable standards. Do you think the SAT serves that function still, as bad a test as it is? Or do you think that it'll be better if colleges do not use the SAT at all?
It's really interesting. A college entrance exam reflects mainstream educational aspirations and ideals, right? If you go back to look at the exams that Harvard was using throughout the 19th century and before, students are translating passages, long passages, from Latin into English, or from Greek into English, or the way around. The SAT rolls out in 1929 and was a very rigorous standard for a long time, until they really started to mess with it in the 90s. Okay, around a lot of charges and accusations that the SAT was biased towards different backgrounds. I think the SAT has been reflective of, and the changes in the SAT have been reflective of this downward slope in standards that we've had. And the final straw is just getting rid of the test altogether, right? Which is what they're doing now with test optional. And two things really happen with test optional. About 95% right now of colleges are test optional. It's almost everyone. There's a few exceptions, Patrick Henry and Christendom, and most students still submit to places like Hillsdale, and they may go back to requiring a test. But two things happened. One was that, post George Floyd, you had people like Congressman Bowman on the floor of the United States Congress saying that standardized testing was a pillar of systematic racism in America. And that is the thing colleges are most terrified of, is being called racist in any way. They don't want that to happen. The other is that tests actually were not easy to find, right? And so CLT was not that well known at the time. 2020 was pretty crazy for us, as for a while we were kind of the only test available, right? Every testing center was shut down for SAT, ACT. Those two things combined, we went from about 40% of colleges that were test optional to 95%. And so it's going to be really interesting to see what the next few years bring. And a couple colleges have already moved back towards saying, okay, we're not going to require a test for admission, but you can't start your classes until you take one of these tests, because for placement purposes. And so I think that the pendulum is going to swing back towards testing, but maybe in different ways than it was historically.
I mean, so one of the big differences here between your test and the SAT is that it's the passages on your test are actually, and the things that are testing those quasi-neutral skills, right? Like reading comprehension, you're actually giving a student something worth reading and comprehending. On that test, as you say, you're tying them to the great American heritage, the great Western heritage, and to something even beyond that, something that actually ties to something about the human experience. We hear all the time about, in larger context and testing, about what, for example, books will be assigned in English Lit, or and it seems like the standard often for making those decisions, other than pure ideology and sort of identity politics, in a more pernicious and personal way, is, can the students find, quote unquote, find themselves in the text, yeah. Right? And they mean that in a wholly superficial way. Like, yeah. Are there any left-handed bisexual 11-year-old redheads in this text? Well, if not, then this text is irrelevant, to people of that description. I mean, what feedback have you gotten from students taking this test about? I mean, for many of them, I imagine this may be the first time that they are actually confronting and reading texts that generations have found valuable, about something about the human condition that might be universal.
The question about source material, I mean, this is kind of the main reason why we launched. And so SAT and ACT both have these ridiculous sensitivity committees. I think they're ridiculous because, and our chief operating officer here at CLT, She worked for all of Pearson, New Meridian, all of the big testing companies. And it went from, okay, we don't want students to read something that they would have an adverse reaction to, and it would be distracting the test taking process, to now kind of finding everything offensive. Okay. My COO tells stories about them not being allowed to use passages with two married parents, right? Because that would trigger or be very upsetting to students from a single family home. Not being able to use heterosexual relationships, as that would make gay students feel uncomfortable as well. And so like everything gets winnowed out to being offensive, which is why the SAT, you end up reading literally passages about penguins in Antarctica, right? Because apparently nobody's had a bad experience with penguins in Antarctica. And so that's the kind of source material they're left using. CLT, we really take, and we've kind of bucked the entire industry trend with this, is we take almost the exact opposite approach. Is we say, look, if a text can't offend anyone, it's probably not very important either, right? And so, and we get positive feedback. We also get negative feedback. We got a bunch of Christians and Catholics that take our test. We put Nietzsche on our test. We put Darwin on our test. Those are crucially important authors for young people to be reading. And they may not be passages that the young people agree with, but we actually want to make the case that it's the mark of an educated person to read something and to comprehend it, even if you don't understand it, and do so without having an emotional meltdown at the same time.
Yeah, I mean, so when did we lose the idea of connecting backwards in time to some of these great texts, whether it's philosophy or literature, that they actually may find some, we may actually find, ironically, like that personal connection that I think a lot of modern education is so obsessed with. I think we're really locking students out of something, one, universal about the human experience, but two, we're locking them out of being able to understand each other through a common body of whatever you want to call it, the canon, right? And it's not that I don't recognize that the canon changes over time. Obviously, things are added, and it's a debatable thing what is and isn't canon. But the quality of some of the texts that even when I was in high school, I mean, I remember House on Mango Street, for example, was like a big assigned. That's not a comparable text to, I don't know, Jane Eyre, right? It just isn't. And it's much more superficial and has much less to say about questions that will confront these students at some point in their lives about, love, life, death, religion. These are questions that every person at some point in their lives runs into, right? A lot of people try to block them out as long as possible, but life has a way of forcing you to confront some of these questions. And I worry how many students who are ostensibly, quote unquote, well-educated don't have anything to fall back on in their education for those moments of life, as opposed to, quote unquote, college and career.
You reference kind of the universal human experiences, experiences of longing or betrayal, these are not, they go far beyond the superficial things, skin color and others. The idea that Black students in New York City or something can't relate to Shakespeare is incredibly denigrating to those students, right? Can they not relate to being in love with somebody that your family is not accepting of, right? All of these things transcend space and time. And I think we're finally having a national conversation about this. But, and as a book that hit me really hard this year was, and I finally just read it, which I'm kind of embarrassed to admit, is Alan Bloom's The Closing of the American Mind. And I would really, really recommend it. And I think it captures, for me, it kind of articulated a lot of the things that I understood, but the loss of education as transmission. And so if you think about what even is education, most generations understood it as a kind of like sacred transmission. I think there's a visual image I'd love to share with you. I was at a bar mitzvah for one of my daughter's friends years ago, and I was thinking through all of this stuff at the time. and she was a really tiny little girl, right? And her parents, during this ceremony, they passed down to her this massive Torah, right, during this ceremony. And it was kind of funny because she was so tiny. She's holding this massive scroll that covers up her whole face and everything. But what it was the passing down of what mattered most, right? And fundamentally, that's what education was, right? Chesterton describes education as the soul of a society being passed from one generation to the next. That understanding about education as fundamentally about transmission of the best of what has been thought and said, that is what has been wholly lost in the mainstream K-12 environment. And my hope is that, as parents are seeing a lot of the nonsense that their students, that their children are ingesting, now that so many students are at home, that they're going to look at traditional options, classical options, as an answer to where they want their kids to go instead.
Yeah, how do you make that case for a civilizational transmission, as you would call it, in an age where people are so morally certain that everyone in the past was morally repugnant, right? And not worth admiring for any of their deeds or their personal qualities, but merely judging them by the fashionable standards of the age, or even the things that aren't just fashionable standards of the age, right? Like the deep evil of human slavery. How do you make the case for truly classical learning and a transmission of civilizational, soul, as you just quoted Chesterton, right? When a lot of people no longer think the soul of our civilization is worth transmitting.
Such a thoughtful question. So another book that you've got to read is C.S. Lewis's Abolition of Man. I think it is the most important book in the 20th century about education, and it's really interesting what Lewis does. Essentially, he grounds the idea of basically what we would call in the West something like natural law. In the Abolition of Man, he refers to it as the Tao instead, and he makes the case that education was conforming the pupil to reality, right? The universal realities that, and Lewis makes his case elsewhere as well, that what we would call morality really isn't that different from place to place, right? You generally have the concepts to treat each other well, to not, commit adultery, to not lie, to not steal. These things are not honored in any flourishing society. Any flourishing society has the same basic understanding of natural law or the Tao. And that Lewis makes the point that education traditionally was to get the pupil to conform to that existing reality, right? And be happier doing so. And that's what ruptured. And Lewis saw it coming in the 20th century. And I think that's what's these classical schools, a lot of the classical tradition is being re-embraced among the Catholic schools as well. That's the fundamental difference, I think, if that makes sense in answering your question.
You've really had sorry, you've really had a lot of success in kind of advocating for this classical vision across ideological lines, right? In the higher ed space, I think about Hillsdale College and St. John's University, right? Two classical based models of higher education. And you've held a conference with folks like Professor George, who was on this podcast, and Cornel West, who is definitely a man of the left. And it seems like they've both found something in the vision that I don't even want to say advocating as much as reviving, right? In education. I mean, have you had broader success reaching people through talking about this model of education beyond, I'm just thinking of Cornel West now, but beyond Cornel West, who's a really open guy for a man of the left, I think, to at least talk about conservative ideas. Have you had broader success in talking about this vision of education with perhaps people who think that the past was shameful or come at it from a more sort of woke left perspective?
Yeah, it's been tough, and as you know, I think we're in this, especially social media age, a digital age, where like everybody gets pigeonholed or kind of pushed into one direction or another. People just don't have categories almost anymore for things that can possibly transcend like a political lens to look at the world. I love Cornel West. He's been incredibly engaged and friendly. I talked to him a number of times over the past year, in addition to the podcast and having him out. And I think he gets the importance of that. And the interesting thing about Cornel West is that he's so far to the left of even people on the left that when he stops and says, wait a minute, the tradition of Jerusalem and Athens are unique contributions to the whole world. We need to pay particular attention to the value of these traditions. So I think, and I wish there were more voices like him. And we have connected with a few. In fact, I co-host my own podcast with Aruba Asim, who's a young college student who's actually Muslim, who's found this tradition as well. In fact, one of our most downloaded episodes we did for the Anchor podcast is with Hamza Youssef, who's a Muslim scholar, good friends with Robbie George as well, who's the president of Zaytuna College in California, a Muslim liberal arts college. And so there is, for classical education, you know, there's a revival of this going on in Jewish communities and secular communities, Christian communities, Muslim communities. I think what it is a rediscovering of the beauty of tradition. And look, everybody on some level, everybody gets this, right? It's the reason why I think, you know, like Downton Abbey and, you know, The Crown and Outlander, it's why they do so well on Netflix and why people are so enamored with, like, there's something captivating and beautiful about the old world, right? But there's this like hard place that modern man is in, and that he's captivated with the beauty of the old world, but at the same time, he hates the ideas that led those people to build what they built, right? And these people were not cultural relativists at all, right? They had very fixed idea about who God was and who man is. And so, yeah, you know, we're having a lot of fun. I wish that there were more folks on the left politically that were enthusiastic about this. Interestingly, CLT itself, we're almost 50-50 in terms of we're this rare place where we have great conversations about all things political. We have like diehard Bernie Sanders fans here and diehard Trump fans here, and have really thoughtful conversations politically. But I think it's because there's a common ground in a love for the classics that transcends, you know, national kind of spectator politics that allows us to have something deeper. And that's, I think, a big problem with where we're at nationally right now, is that there's not something deeper, right, than like the silliness of national spectator politics that people can relate to. And so if you're not agreeing for like the same, you know, old person, then there's not a common ground anymore, right? Whereas I think this is what classical education can bring. And again, you know, this isn't a new thing. This is the way 100% of America's founders were educated. This just was education. In fact, the only reason we keep, you know, using this modifier classical is to just, we're getting back at like what always was education until radical progressive education became the new norm in the 20th century.
Yeah, you know, Thomas Jefferson was the strongest advocate for what we would consider what he called public schooling or universal schooling, but we would consider today actually just public funding, right? Public funding for universal education, which was not at all a foregone conclusion in the beginning of America, right? You might ask yourself why a country where so much was left out of government purview, right? Why education isn't completely privatized or wasn't completely privatized in the beginning of America. And his answer was largely what you just said. In a republic, there needs to be a common ground, like a common body of understanding, not only about, you know, the three branches of government and the Constitution, although they basically he strongly endorsed what today would be called, you know, indoctrination or patriotic education, right? But something broader. I think that you had to be in a republic, you had to be an educated person and know how to live in a republic. You know, how do you reconcile? So certainly that's not what's at heart of the public education system today, right?
Not at all.
I like to joke that it's actively anti-Americanizing people. I mean, it's not really a joke. It is anti-Americanizing, young Americans. But is it even compatible with the way structurally that we do education? Meaning, government run schools that get a check from the government per pupil, that have a certain number of hours a day. Well, this is, outdated post-pandemic, but like, button seat time. Students take a certain course, a standardized course, and then they take the SAT at the end. And if they're successful, they go to university where they learn how to be cultural Marxists.
And that's great. And as you're UVA law, is that correct?
It was, yeah. I graduated a few years ago.
Okay, so spent time in Charlottesville, and I had a number of years fascinated with Jefferson, and really, what was education for Thomas Jefferson? I mean, arguably, I love JFK's quote, where he's speaking to the winner of I guess the Nobel Prize winners, and he says, we've never had so many educated minds in D.C. except for when Thomas Jefferson dined alone, right? Absolute prodigy from a very young age, but education for him is classical languages, right? It is logic, right? So much of what was fundamental, even, Jefferson, who translated his own version of the Bible, thought biblical knowledge was crucial to being an educated person. Our young people today, they can't understand, they can't go to DC and read Lincoln's Gettysburg Address or his second inaugural address and comprehend it, because he makes biblical references where there's absolutely no knowledge, whatsoever. So what Jefferson, what Frederick Douglass considered education, the meat and potatoes of it is completely gone. And so it's a difficult question. Like, what do you do with Jefferson's advocacy for, publicly funded kind of education, when what his vision for education looks entirely different from what mainstream education now is, which is honestly, Inez, and maybe you have some better insight than I do into this, it's really, really hard to define, right? Like, if you ask even a high school administrator or a high school superintendent, like, what is education? Like, it should be a pretty simple question, but you really can't get any kind of clear answer for what, like, we're even doing. I mean, we spend $1 trillion a year as a country on this thing we call education, and it's vague. Like, they'll say, well, we're building critical thinking skills and higher level thinking skills, and you say, what do you mean by that, right? And often crickets. Like, it's not really clear, because again, we've lost this idea of transmitting the best of what has been thought and said, passing down the richness of this tradition. And so in some ways they're actively undermining the tradition instead. Like, that's the work that's happening in schools. I think maybe indoctrinating into acceptable, political views. But it is in a state of absolute crisis, I think, at the moment.
Yeah. So we're having this conversation on the eve of School Choice Week. Do you think that your vision of education, I guess the question number one would be, do you think your vision of education can succeed in 2022 in America without an underlying system of school choice that is substantially more pluralistic than we have now, given that it's a minority vision? But two, sort of a more difficult question, I think, for those of us who are on the right or approach school choice, or is can that vision of the good, because you're advancing an actual substantive vision that you are labeling a good education, right? Or even an education at all. And how is that compatible with a pluralistic system where every student and family chooses for themselves what the best education is?
Yeah, I think overwhelmingly, I mean, advocacy for school choice, it depends on, you got to believe in the common normal parent to make really, really good decisions. Like, suddenly, I love the school choice because it's such a humble opinion. It's like the parent, like the normal everyday American parent, is actually the expert. Like, not the bureaucrats, not the people at the Department of Ed or the state local board of education. It's the parents that are the experts. And and as in my experience, when you present any parent at all with classical education versus mainstream modern progressive education, like, every parent that I've experienced really opts for classical, right? Like, parents want traditional moral formation to happen in school. They want their kid to come back more honest, not less honest, right? They want them to come back more disciplined. in their habits, not less, more responsible, not less responsible. Like that kind of formation, character formation, is embedded in classical education, right? I mean, do they want their kids reading, Aesop's Fables and the Chronicles of Narnia, or, Diary of a Wimpy Kid and whatever nonsense? I mean, I think that the best way to get a pulse of where mainstream K-12 is at right now is to just go to like your local book fair and see the books that are being offered up to young people right now, and it's pretty abysmal. Like none. And what's been really interesting to me, I think most people within the classical renewal movement are pretty new within this movement. I just discovered it myself really 6, 7, 8 years ago. But children know quality. Like they know quality. And as soon as I started bringing home like Grimm's fairy tales and Aesop's fables, they didn't want the new stuff anymore. They wanted the old stuff. They were way more engaged. And this is what makes classical education so powerful. It's like there's a reason why these stories like Beauty and the Beast and Cinderella, where we don't even necessarily know where they come from, like they're hundreds and hundreds of years old, but they survived, whereas all of these other stories were just lost to time. But these stories somehow had staying power. Every generation said, this story is so powerful, we're going to pass it down. We're going to tell this story to our children. And then they told it to their children. That's what makes a classic, because it taps into these universal human longings and desires that transcend wherever they're at. I think this kind of education really appeals to parents. And if they have the choice, we're going to continue to see a massive explosion of classical education. And it's already happening. I mean, you look at Great Hearts. We have dear friends at Great Hearts. The founder's classical. Erica Donalds is a dear friend. She's on our board. She's rolling out new classical schools in Florida all the time. Of course, her husband is a member of the U.S. Congress. They're both diehard advocates for school choice. But like every classical charter I've ever come in contact with has a wait list that is often bigger than the enrollment of the entire school. And so as soon as these schools are going to get launched, parents says, yes, give me sanity, give me tradition, give me the tried and true. That's what I want for my kids, rather than these new ideas that were baked up 5 minutes ago about, gender and everything else.
When I'm thinking about how we measure the success or failure of our education system, there's no measure, and maybe that's why the CLT is so important, but there's really no measure for, in all of the metrics and all of the like boring sort of grids of federal, in federal education law, there's really nothing that measures or connects in any way with anything that you just said in the last 5 minutes, right? All of the metrics are about college and career readiness, which then became Common Core, which then became like, there's all these buzzwords, right, in education. There's very little about formation or preparing students for life as opposed to technical knowledge. I mean, do you think that that's just the inevitable consequence of kind of the progressive era and an elevation of expertise in a bureaucratic world? Or I'm putting expertise in quotes, but there is such a thing as real technical expertise. Would you separate that entirely from the notion of education? Would you separate education versus technical training? How would you ensure that students in this classical education world are prepared also for the practicalities of life, as opposed to the more important, perhaps, like deeper formation of their characters?
No, I think it's a great paradox of this movement, in that classical schools are in no way aimed at making students college and career ready, which is kind of the creed of the College Board. It's the creed of kind of mainstream K-12 education. But ironically, they're making the most employable young people ever, right? Their vision is human flourishing. Their idea is a cultivation of virtue as traditionally understood. And what's really strange is for like thousands of years, what is a good education? A good education in the first century looked a lot like a good education in the 14th century or even the early 20th century. It didn't change all that much. And suddenly we're supposed to believe that what is a good education looks nothing like it looked in all of these other generations, right? They actually use the word formation traditionally. They still do, right? At seminaries, right? They talk about formation because you would go away and come back different. And we're talking about character development, moral responsibility, becoming an actual adult, where in America we have a crisis of adulthood, which is mainly fueled by education that doesn't cultivate responsibility.
Say more about that, because it's always something that gets me in trouble on like places like Twitter, that I am totally perplexed by my generation, which millennials, as we hit our 30s and even into our mid or late 30s. I'm totally perplexed by the things that so many people in my generation are obsessed with, like fandoms and Disney and like things that are quintessentially childish. And it's not that it's like the worst thing in the world to, of course you can enjoy Star Wars or enjoy whatever you want. It's a free country, but it does strike me as what you're saying, like a crisis of adulthood, that nobody finds joy in sort of the adult things in life versus the things that a 5-year-old would find entertaining. I don't understand. It's not even so much. I mean, it is being a little judgy, but but it's not even so much that. Laying that aside, I genuinely don't understand it. I don't understand how an adult's attention at 35 is held by some of this really childish stuff. But it does. Like, we have an entire generation that wants to dive back into a ball pit.
Yeah. It is an absolute crisis, and as Ben Sass has become a good friend over the past couple of years, and he wrote a book that I love, and regardless of if you agree with Ben or not on Trump and their whole battle, Ben has the best insight and vision, I think, for what education ought to be. He is hook, line, and sinker behind classical education, and he wrote a book called The Vanishing American Adult, and again, regardless of your views on his relationship with Trump or whatnot, it is an incredible read on this crisis of the loss of adulthood. And it is absolutely connected to education, right? That because education is no longer about human formation, about making people into responsible men and women who want to be responsible men and women, that's why we have this crisis of 35-year-olds who are playing video games in their parents' basement and see nothing wrong with it, right? Like, no 35-year-old should be comfortable just playing video games in their parents' basement like every day. Like, that's kind of a cultural, civilizational crisis. They should be doing something good for culture, for society. And all of this goes back to education. It is a fundamental reason that, we've seen this. And he actually starts that book off by talking about, 2016, 17, the phrase adulting, kind of is like the word of the year, adulting. You hear it all the time back then. I guess it's kind of gone out a little bit by now, but people were kind of like making fun of doing the laundry, adulting, like because it's almost like comical, at this point, because we were never raised or formed that we had to become adults, or that we ought to become adults, and that was actually a beautiful, good thing to become.
Yeah, it's an interesting phenomenon for sure. I also, it's tragic when I think about the kind of education that you're advocating for. I'm so jealous that I really didn't get that. I'm not saying my education was terrible by any means, but I really didn't get that classical grounding. I had to do a lot of it myself, which genuinely, I mean, some people are autodidacts, but I genuinely think there is so much value in good teaching, good mentorship, having a guide in some of these texts, or somebody who has read them many times and thought about them for a long time, because like a lot of these texts are difficult to break into on your own, sort of without a guide out in, YouTube land or whatever. But I'm like actively regretful, because it's so much easier to learn in the period of time, particularly I think in modern life, in the period of time that's set aside for learning, than it is when you are an adult later in your life, right? And so I guess I've never thought about it before. Maybe that is part of our crisis of adulting or whatever, is that at the time in our lives when we had the most time, the most brain plasticity, better memory, better everything, we wasted our time with some of these really frivolous, childish texts. And then it's hard. It's hard as an adult to go back. And I mean, podcast guest and buddy Spencer Clavin, I think, does a really, really good job of opening up these texts for people who didn't have that kind of rigorous classical education. But it's hard. It takes, setting aside a lot of time in your busy adult lives. It takes like a sort of skill that most people lose over the course once they get through that education part of their lives or graduate from college or whatever it is, in terms of like focusing for a long time on a dense text and then thinking about it afterwards. It's really a shame, and maybe that's part of the reason that people in my generation are diving back into what was easy and nostalgic, because that's kind of all we've got to fall back on. We can't then take out a text where we might have had a childish understanding or a surface level understanding, in let's say 8th grade, but then still has so much to teach, a 35-year-old and a 55-year-old and an 80-year-old, right?
It's so true. And I think it's even harder now, that we've got these toxic little devices that we all carry with us. I had, one of my best memories, and I had no idea at the time how formative it was on me, when I was 21 years old, drove all the way from Louisiana to Alaska for a summer. And I spent the summer working in the slime lines, but in Alaska, it never really gets that dark until about midnight. And so I would read, and there was nothing to distract me. There was nothing to do but read, right? I think I learned more that summer. Remember, I got a copy of I can never say it right because of a childhood speech impediment, Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment. And it was like I could do that or twiddle my thumbs. There was nothing else to do from like 7 until I would fall asleep, and read deeper than I ever have probably since then in my entire life. And those great stories, which are deeply formative, if we're missing this window to put young people in front of the best stories, the stories that are going to inspire them to live lives of heroic virtue, the stories that have been passed down from generation to generation, it's a missed opportunity. And you're so right. You used the word plasticity a minute ago.
Or tried to.
Yeah. Language acquisition, it peaks at age 7 or 8. Kids are sponges for language. The fact that, most of our schools don't even introduce the language till maybe middle school, but usually not till high school, missed opportunity. These classical schools, I've got my kiddos in a classical school now. They're doing Latin at 7 or 8 years old, and they're absolute sponges for it, right? And they like it. It clicks. It makes sense to them. And I'd say, one other thing I wanted to mention here is I really think if you're hearing this podcast, the best argument I think for this kind of education is honestly just meeting these young people. And I want to be careful in saying that, because I don't want to bash, public school. I'm in amazing public school families. I taught in public schools for 10 years. But if you go to a classical charter, you go to a classical school like the Veritas School in Richmond, or you meet some of these homeschool students, it's shocking. Like, these young people are amazing. The way they, especially these homeschool students, where, people have this silly idea that they're like wearing, denim overalls and they're right. These students are brilliant. They excel in things like debate. In fact, my interaction with homeschool kids is they seem way more socially adjusted and far less awkward, especially talking to adults, I think, than like your typical run of the mill, kid from mainstream schooling right now. And I think that is what is going to make this movement continue to just take off is when people say, wow, I want my 2-year-old to be like that when they're 16 or 17. I'm going to put them in that kind of school.
So to round this out and wrap it up, it's so, the vision you're sort of laying out, it sounds wonderful. I mean, it's giving me sort of regret, like I said, about the education that I received. But but we've talked about and agree that it's not what's on offer. Last year was the best, last legislative session was the best year for school choice, probably ever. I think it's arguable to say ever, even from the early days when those programs started. There have been so many new programs passed that allow families to do exactly what you just said. If they see a 16-year-old who just seems to have really flourished and been given that classical foundation. It gives them, their 5-year-old, regardless of what their financial background might be, gives them hope that they can actually put their 5-year-old on the same track. How is school choice the prerequisite in our current system? I mean, I said before that there is some tension between the idea of a pluralistic system and a universally valuable idea of what education is. But, how is school choice integral to your classical vision?
Yeah, again, I think primarily you put parents in front of these two different options, or maybe countless different options. And I think, generally, and fine, if parents look at it and they say, okay, I've looked at a classical option and I'm also looking at a modern progressive option, I'm going to stick with this. More power to them. That's fine. I don't think that's going to happen a whole lot, though. I think the majority of parents across the political spectrum, right, center, left, wherever they may be, I think that again, they're going to value this kind of education, and we're seeing that already. I think we can use, again, these kind of classical charter schools as examples for what will happen if we open this up and just let competition happen, among these schools. It is, education is a sacred thing. It's not something to just mess with and to introduce new ideas, educational philosophies that are sometimes younger than the students in the classroom, right? We want to be really careful before we shift in fundamental ways, as the mainstream schools have done in the past few decades, what we're doing, why we're doing it, the ends of education. So I think, and there's all different varieties as well of these classical schools. I'm a Roman Catholic. I love Catholicism. We go to a very classical, very Catholic school. It's fantastic, right? Classical education is also taking off, as I understand it, among a lot of atheists and agnostics as well. There's classical Jewish schools. Again, I co-host a podcast with a Muslim. So talking about within the classical framework, there is a vision, because it is fundamentally centered on universal human things, that I think makes it far more compatible with a pluralistic society than what mainstream K-12 is offering right now, where actually what is kind of being forced, and for many families there's no way out of it, does not align to their own vision, their own values, or the things that are most universal for all of us.
Well, I'm really glad that so many parents and so many families are seeing the value in this type of education. I think this might be one of my most optimistic podcasts ever. It's so gratifying to know that there is this underground movement, that is obviously not getting a lot of media coverage or being noticed by the sort of powers that be, but the idea that there are, thousands and thousands, perhaps millions of families and students who are quietly sort of enrolling their kids in this great tradition of passing down the soul of civilization is very cheering to me.
Yeah, I love this. Love the conversation. And you're absolutely right. I mean, this has been a movement that has been off the radar now for 3 decades. Slowly, the classical movement in the homeschool world and in the charter school world and the Catholic world and all these different spheres. And it's coming together now as one movement where they're all kind of saying the same thing and pointing back to the tradition, I think, that was at the center of really why America's founders, the stories, the vision, the kind of education that formed them into the leaders that they were to cast, I believe, the best vision for a nation that you could possibly have. Inez, this has been a delight to chat with you this morning. Love what you're doing here on the podcast, and thank you for all of your work advancing school choice.
Well, thank you so much for coming on, Jeremy Wayne Tate. You can find him at CLT and also on Twitter and his own podcast, Anchored. And thank you to our listeners. High Noon with Inez Stepman is a production of the Independent Women's Forum. As always, you can send comments and questions to inez.stepman@iwf.org. Please help us out by hitting the subscribe button and leaving us a comment or review on Apple Podcasts, Acast, Google Play, YouTube, or iwf.org. Be brave. We'll see you next time on High Noon.